Hello everyone, and welcome back to A One Storyteller, the place where emotions run deep and every story has a twist that'll leave you reflecting on life long after it's over. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another gripping tale. Today's story is a thought-provoking one. It involves an act of prejudice, the consequences of assumptions, and the ultimate truth that changes everything. Grab your popcorn, settle in, and let's dive into a story that asks, how well do we truly know each other, and what happens when we let our biases rule our actions? It was a calm and sunny afternoon in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods, where the streets were lined with tall, leafy trees and houses that looked like something out of a magazine. The people were friendly, the kids played outside, and everything seemed perfect in this picture of suburban life. But beneath the surface, not everyone felt as peaceful as the serene environment suggested. Carlos had been working as a garbage man in this neighborhood for over 5 years. He had seen it all: families come and go, new faces, familiar ones, and the occasional grumpy resident. But despite his service to the community, he was still, in the eyes of some, just the man who came to pick up trash, a nameless, faceless worker in the background of their comfortable lives. Carlos was used to this. He didn't expect much more than polite nods and the occasional small talk with the kids who waved at him every morning as he drove down the street. But he wasn't expecting what happened that day. It started like any other day. He got in his truck, a little weathered but reliable, and began his rounds. As he reached the familiar stretch of street lined with well-kept houses, he saw a young girl standing on her porch. Emily, the daughter of the Johnsons, was waving at him, her blonde hair shimmering in the sunlight. She was always a cheerful kid, friendly and kind, with a smile that could brighten anyone's day. Carlos smiled and waved back, but something felt different today. Emily seemed distracted, her eyes following him with a curiosity that felt a little too intense. As he drove past her, Carlos caught sight of something that made him uneasy. A woman standing in her driveway, watching him closely. It was Karen, who lived a few houses down from Emily. Carlos had seen Karen around before, but he'd never exchanged more than a few pleasantries with her. Today, though, she wasn't just standing there casually, she was glaring at him, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, it wasn't unusual for people to notice him, but Karen's stare felt different, almost accusatory. Karen was a woman who had always been outspoken, especially about the things she didn't like. She had a reputation in the neighborhood as someone who wasn't shy about expressing her opinion. It wasn't the kind of opinion that you'd find in a Sunday sermon, though. It was more of the kind that made people uncomfortable, made them question her views, and wonder how someone with so much privilege could think the way she did. She stood in her driveway, arms folded, staring at Carlos as he continued down the street. There was something about the way he moved, the way he operated his truck, that rubbed her the wrong way. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she was certain that something wasn't right. Karen had always considered herself to be a good person, someone who was open-minded and accepting, but deep down she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that people like Carlos didn't belong in her world, in her neighborhood. She didn't know him personally, but she had assumptions about him, based on the color of his skin and the job he held. It wasn't that she hated him, but she didn't trust him either, and as she watched him pass by, something in her snapped. Without saying a word, Karen turned and walked into her house. Her mind was racing. She needed to act. She needed to make sure that the neighborhood was safe, that people who weren't right for it were kept out. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and waited for the call to connect. When the dispatcher answered, Karen's voice was firm, but there was an edge of fear in it. "Hello," she said, her tone urgent. "I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. There's a black man driving a garbage truck. I've seen him driving around multiple times today, and I'm not sure what he's doing. He's acting suspicious, and I don't feel comfortable." The dispatcher, used to all kinds of calls, calmly asked for further details. Karen gave a description of Carlo's truck, the route he was taking, and her reasons for feeling uncomfortable. She was insistent, almost frantic in her description of the situation. She didn't even stop to think for a second that perhaps her assumptions were based on something that wasn't real, something that wasn't fair. By the time she hung up the phone, she felt a sense of relief. She had done the right thing in her mind. She had taken action. The neighborhood would be safe again. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Carlos, just finishing up his round, was sitting in his truck as the officers pulled up behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Maybe they were stopping to ask for directions or report something he wasn't aware of. But as the officers stepped out of their cars, he noticed their expressions were serious. One officer was a tall man, his face calm but stern. The other officer, a woman, was scanning the street as if looking for something. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carlos asked, trying to maintain his composure despite the anxiety building in his chest. The officer's response was calm but firm. "We received a report about suspicious activity in the area. We need to ask you a few questions." Carlos's heart sank. He had been doing his job driving down the street he had visited countless times. Why would anyone think he was suspicious? "I'm just doing my job, officer," Carlos said, stepping out of his truck. "I've been working here for years. I don't understand why you're here." But the officer didn't say much. Instead, he motioned for Carlos to stay put as he went over to Karen, who had come out to watch the situation unfold. She stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, her face flushed with a mixture of guilt and stubbornness. Carlos couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the way Karen was gesturing toward him. He couldn't believe it. This was the woman who had never said anything to him, the woman who had decided in her mind that he didn't belong here. As the officers continued their exchange with Karen, Carlos stood still, feeling an overwhelming sense of confusion and frustration. He had always prided himself on being respectful and professional, doing his job diligently without causing any trouble. But now, here he was, standing under the harsh gaze of a woman who didn't even know him, who had never taken the time to understand who he truly was. Carlos tried to remain calm as the officers asked for his identification, their eyes scanning his name, job title, and even the details of his employment records. Everything checked out perfectly. He was doing exactly what he was paid to do: collect garbage, keep the streets clean, and maintain order in a community that needed his services. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how legitimate his job or his presence in the neighborhood was, it didn't matter to Karen. To her, he was just another other, someone who didn't belong, based on nothing more than the color of his skin and his occupation. The female officer came back after checking everything thoroughly and said, "Ma'am, this man is licensed and employed here. He's been working in this neighborhood for years. He's been doing his job without incident, and there's no reason to believe he's doing anything suspicious. This is a misunderstanding." For a moment, Karen stood there frozen. Her face turned bright red as the truth sank in. Her actions had been based on nothing more than assumptions and stereotypes, and now it was clear to everyone, including herself, how wrong she had been. She didn't know what to say. The officers stood silently, awaiting her response. I didn't know," Karen stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind was racing, trying to justify her actions, but deep down she knew there was no excuse for what she had done. Carlos, now realizing the full extent of what had transpired, took a step back. "Ma'am, you don't know me. You don't know my story. You've made an assumption based on something I had no control over. I'm just here to do my job like everyone else. I don't deserve to be treated this way." His words hit harder than Karen expected. It wasn't just about the humiliation she felt at that moment, but the realization that she had betrayed her own value. She had been quick to judge, and now she was being confronted by the very man she had wronged. The male officer turned toward Karen, his expression neutral, yet not without a tinge of disappointment. "We're going to wrap this up, ma'am, but I suggest you reflect on what's just happened here. It's important to question your assumptions and perhaps take a step back and reconsider. how we view others based on our biases. As the officers began to leave, Karen's gaze shifted to Carlos one last time. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She was paralyzed by guilt, realizing how deeply wrong she had been. Emily, the young girl who had been standing quietly on her porch during the entire ordeal, now took a step forward. She had been watching everything unfold, absorbing the tension in the air. While Karen's actions had clearly rattled Carlos, it was Emily who now felt an urge to speak out. The scene felt like something out of a bad dream. She had never imagined that something like this would happen in her own neighborhood, let alone to someone like Carlos, who had always been kind to her. He was someone she had waved at every morning, someone she trusted without a second thought. And now, her neighbor Karen had accused him of something he hadn't done, all based on prejudice and a hasty assumption. Emily took a deep breath, her small frame quivering slightly as she stepped toward Karen. Her voice, though quiet, rang with the sincerity of a young girl who had witnessed an injustice. "Karen, you shouldn't have called the police," Emily said softly, her words carrying a weight that surprised everyone around her. "Carlos is a good person. He's always been nice to me. Why would you think he was doing something wrong?" As Karen blinked, stunned. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Here was a child, someone who had no reason to defend Carlos, standing up to her, pointing out the very flaw in her thinking. The irony of it hit her like a ton of bricks. Emily was standing up for someone she barely knew, someone whose entire existence had been reduced to a stereotype in Karen's mind. Karen opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. I just thought," Karen started, but she didn't finish her sentence. How could she justify her actions now? How could she explain that she had let fear and bias dictate her decisions? Emily's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on Karen's arm gently, her voice now filled with the kind of wisdom that often comes from seeing things with clarity at an early age. "I think you should think about it, about why you did what you did," Emily said. "Carlos was just doing his job. He didn't hurt anyone. You don't need to be afraid of him. You don't need to be afraid of anyone just because of how they look." Karen could feel her throat tighten. Emily was right. She had been so consumed by fear and prejudice, so ready to act on her assumptions without questioning them. And now this young girl was showing her the truth she had refused to see. The silence between them was heavy, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Karen felt vulnerable. The strength she had clung to in her biased beliefs was slipping away, leaving her exposed, just as the tension started to fade. Emily, who had been quietly watching from her porch, walked over to Karen. She looked at her with a mixture of confusion and disappointment in her eyes. "Karen," Emily said softly, her voice shaking slightly, "you shouldn't have called the police. Carlos is a good person. You've always been kind to me." Karen's mouth went dry. She had no defense, no excuse. Emily's words, spoken with the innocence and sincerity of a child, pierced through the walls Karen had built around herself. Emily's words echoed in her mind as she stood there, realizing that she had done something deeply wrong, something that couldn't be undone. The day after the incident, Karen woke up feeling a heaviness in her chest. She had hoped the events of yesterday were just a nightmare, something her mind had conjured in a moment of stress, but they weren't. The confrontation with Carlos, the young girl's words, and the embarrassment of her actions weighed on her all night, lingering like a storm cloud. Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring at her cup of coffee without really seeing it. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting soft, golden beams on the floor, but it didn't bring any comfort. She had been through a range of emotions since the police had left the neighborhood the day before. Shame, anger, disbelief, confusion. But now, as she sat in her kitchen, she knew she couldn't just ignore what had happened. "What kind of person am I?" she whispered to herself, the question echoing in her mind like an unanswered call. The night before, after the officers had left, Karen had been alone in her home, reflecting on everything. She kept replaying Emily's words over and over. You don't need to be afraid of anyone just because of how they look. They seemed to pierce through her defenses, and she felt the weight of them long after Emily had gone back inside. Karen knew she had been wrong, but the real question was, why had she acted that way? She couldn't help but feel embarrassed by her actions. She had treated Carlos as if he didn't belong, based solely on the fact that he was a black man working a job she had never really thought twice about. Why had she felt so threatened by his presence in her neighborhood, a neighborhood that prided itself on being friendly and open? Her pride, her privilege, had clouded her ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize that the real threat to her neighborhood wasn't the people she was so quick to judge, but the assumptions that led her to do so. "I have to make it right," Karen finally said out loud, her voice determined but tinged with uncertainty. She wasn't sure how to make things right. What could she do to repair the damage she had done? The next day, Karen took the first step. She knew she had to speak to Carlos. The apology would have to come from her, and she knew it couldn't be just a simple sorry. It would need to be heartfelt, genuine. Because she owed him more than just an apology. She owed him an understanding. It wasn't easy for her to pick up the phone and dial his number. She wasn't sure how he would react, or if he would even want to speak to her. After all, she had made him feel unsafe and unwelcome in a place he had every right to be. When Carlos answered, his voice was neutral, but there was an edge of caution to it. "Hello?" he asked. "Carlos?" Karen's voice trembled a little. "It's Karen, the one who called the police yesterday. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Karen could almost feel the tension through the phone. "I know what I did was wrong, Carlos," Karen continued, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about who you are. I called the police out of fear, and I treated you unfairly. I'm sorry. Truly sorry. You didn't deserve that, and I want to make it right." There was another long pause. Then, finally, Carlos spoke, his voice calm but guarded. "I appreciate your apology, Karen," he said slowly, "but actions speak louder than words. I understand people make mistakes, but it's what we do after we make those mistakes that really matters." His words hit her hard. She knew he was right. She couldn't just apologize and hope it would all go away. It wasn't that simple. "I'm ready to do what it takes," Karen said, her voice steady now. "I want to be better. I want to understand why I acted the way I did, and I want to make it right. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm willing to try." Carlos was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm willing to help you with that," he said, "but it's not going to be easy, Karen. It's going to take time, and it'll take a lot of work. You can't just fix it overnight." Karen nodded even though he couldn't see her. She understood she knew it wouldn't be easy. "I'm ready for that," she replied. "I want to do the work." As the days passed, Karen started doing the work she had promised to Carlos. She began reading books about race, privilege, and prejudice. She attended seminars and joined local groups focused on diversity and inclusion. She reached out to Carlos, asking him if she could attend a community meeting with him to learn more about how her assumptions and biases affected people around her. It wasn't easy. Every time she read about the history of racial inequality or the ways in which systemic racism affected people like Carlos, she felt a deep shame. It was hard to confront the fact that she had been part of that system, even in the smallest ways. But each time she reminded herself that it was a necessary part of the journey. At the next neighborhood block party, Karen approached Carlos again. This time, she was determined to make it right, not just for him, but for herself and everyone around her. "Carlos," Karen said, her voice more confident this time, "I just wanted to thank you for giving me a chance. I've been learning a lot, and it's not just about race. It's about empathy, about understanding people as individuals. I'm not perfect, and I'm still learning, but I want to do better, and I want to be someone who can make a real difference, even if it's in small ways." Carlos looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You're on the right path, Karen," he said, nodding. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being open, being willing to change. You've taken the first step, now just keep going." For the first time since their encounter, Karen felt a sense of relief. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully make up for what she had done, but she knew she had started on a path of redemption, a path that would require constant effort, humility, and willingness to grow. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could inspire others to reflect on their own actions, to see people for who they truly were, not by the color of their skin or their job, but by their character. What do you think about Karen's journey? Can someone truly change after making a mistake as big as the one she made? It's not easy, but as we've seen, the willingness to acknowledge our wrongs and take responsibility is the first step toward healing and growth. It's up to all of us to challenge our own biases, to question the assumptions we make about others, and to treat people with the respect and dignity they deserve, no matter their background. Thank you for joining us at A1 Storyteller. If you've enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below about your own thoughts on the story. And remember, it's never too late to change, to grow, and to make the world a better place for everyone. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep questioning, because the more we learn, the better we become.